Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. In this video I'd like to show you how you can grow turnips on a windowsill in an indoor environment, but this will also apply to pots outside as well. But I'm mainly going to focus on the indoor growing environment for people who might be trying to grow it and they don't have a garden or they just have a small balcony. So the type of turnip you really want to be growing are the small varieties. The one that I'm going for today is the purple top Milan. This is a small one that only grows to about the size of a golf ball or a tennis ball if you leave it to grow slightly larger. So the reason you want to look for the small types and the quick maturing types is the other types of turnip, they get really quite large, you get the size of maybe a volleyball or something like that, a small football. Those ones, you need to have them in the garden for the whole year. They take the whole summer really to ripen up and they just get too large for a household environment, and then you just have one giant crop instead of lots of little plants that you can thin and harvest for a longer period. So it's the small ones you're looking for. I'm just going with the purple top Milan because this is quite a common variety that most people can find. It's also quick maturing, so you should be able to get a harvest within about 2 months, maybe 3 months, depending on how big you want to harvest them. Also, they don't take up much space, they're nice and small, and the smaller ones tend to be more tender as well. So they're the best ones to go for if you're thinking of growing them. Now, when it comes to pots, I would recommend planting them in a pot that you're going to keep them in the whole time. So you can either grow individual plants in a 9cm pot, or you can grow a few plants in a larger 2-litre size pot. So I'll talk about the benefits of each one as well. So with a larger pot, the benefit of that is you can selectively harvest them. So you start off picking a few of the small ones and you get some really nice baby ones quite early on, probably just 1 month into the growing. Then after 2 months you'll get some decent sized ones the size of a golf ball that you can pick out as and when you need them. And then you'll be left with about 2 or 3 plants, and they'll probably get to the size of a golf ball, and you can harvest them out about 3 or 4 months. So you get a longer harvesting period, but it does take up more space, and the pots tend to be taller as well. You don't really need a very deep pot for turnips, but they are a root crop, so you want at least an inch or 2. Although they're a root crop, technically, they do have their root mostly above the ground, so you don't need to worry too much about the depth of the pot, as long as it's about 2 or 3 inches deep minimum. Any deeper than that is no problem. And then 9cm pots, the advantage of that is it's a small space. You can just have an individual plant in there. You don't have to worry about thinning it out. But then, of course, as you harvest them, you use up the whole plant. And so if you have about 10 of them, as you harvest them, you've then got just some spare pots. So what you could do is sow with the spare pots and have a continuous crop, or you have them all growing and you harvest them all at the same time. But I would say that depends how you want to grow them. This takes up less space, but you don't have such a long growing period. This takes up more space, but you have a longer growing period. You can have a longer growing period with this, but you just have to keep re-sowing the seeds all the time. Whereas this is more to do with pulling them out individually. So first of all, you want to get some multi-purpose compost. You should be able to find it in most shops quite easily. I would avoid using soil from a garden that's previously had brassicas in it, anything from the cabbage family or radishes, because you can get a disease called club root which can affect the plants. So try and use fresh multi-purpose compost if you can. If you don't have that, use garden soil, but make sure there hasn't been any brassicas or cabbages growing in that recently, otherwise you might have some problems with club root. So when you're filling up your pot with compost, just make sure you break up any large lumps. Quite often with multi-purpose compost, you'll get lumps of compacted compost like this. You just want to break that up, make sure it's nice and fine. You don't have to worry too much about the really small pieces, because the turnip, as I say, it tends to grow on the surface, the root, not so much in the bottom. And so it's the part you're harvesting is the bit at the top. But as long as you don't have any really large pieces like this which impede the roots coming down, you just want to break them up. And occasionally you might get little sticks and things like that, just pull them out as well. But most multi-purpose compost should be fine enough that you shouldn't have any issues with that. So when it comes to sowing the turnips, the seeds are not too small, but they are a little bit fiddly at times. I'll also show you them here. And so they're quite small, probably about the size of couscous grains or quinoa, and so they can be a little bit hard to handle, but generally you can pick them up individually if you need to. So when it comes to the individual plants that you'll be putting in a 9cm pot, I would just get something like a pencil, and I would just make a small hole in the middle there and just pop in 2 seeds. So just carefully pick out the 2 seeds and drop them in like that, and then cover them up again with the compost like so. When it comes to the larger pot, you just want to sprinkle a thin selection. So I probably put about 10 or 20 seeds in here. So I'm just going to sprinkle them on, trying to keep them evenly spaced if I can, but it's not a big issue if they're not evenly spaced, because you can always thin them out later. And you want to put in about 10, even though that seems like quite a lot for this small space, because what you'll do is you'll thin them out as they grow. You'll get a harvest of really small ones, and then that will leave space for the other ones to grow larger. So when you're sprinkling them on the surface like this, what you want to do is just get the compost, make sure it's nice and loose, make sure there's no big pieces in it. You have to make sure it's really fine for this stage, because if any larger lumps sit on top of the seed will try and push up through that big lump and it won't be able to push through. So you want to make sure that the compost is really nice and fine for when you're covering the seeds. And you only need to cover them by about 1 centimetre, because they're quite small seeds, they don't need a lot of coverage. And you just want to gently sprinkle it on top. If you have a riddle or a sieve, this would be ideal, but if you don't, you can just use your hands like this and just give it a fine covering just to make sure they're covered. It's quite important to have them covered because that keeps them damp. It makes watering a lot easier. If they're not covered, then it can dry out and they might not germinate fully. So when it comes to the next stage, all you want to do now is water them in. If you can, place them in a sink and fill the sink up to halfway up the pot, so that the water is just under halfway up the pot, and then what will happen is the water will slowly get sucked up by the compost, and that will dampen the compost. That stops any of the seeds getting washed out. If you were to use a watering can or a bottle of water, you'd probably wash the seeds out. If they weren't washed out, they'd be put into little clumps, and then they would all kind of germinate in the same place. So if you can, soak it in the sink, let it rise up for about an hour or so. That's to be nice and damp, and then from then on you just want to water from the surface. Either use a really fine watering can, or if you can, use a mister, something like this, like a plant mister. If you don't have a plant mister, you can always put a few holes in a water bottle lid, and you can use that as a fine mist as well. So when it comes to the temperature requirements for turnips, they like it quite cool. So a house environment is not the best in summertime. Spring and autumn or winter would probably be the best temperature for these. But that doesn't mean you can't grow them over the summer. You just have to make sure that they're not somewhere really hot. So when it comes to the germination, the temperature, don't worry if it's too hot. That's not a big issue. They'll still germinate. So anywhere around 20 degrees is perfect. Up to 30 maximum. I wouldn't go anywhere warmer than 30. But around 15 to 20 degrees, that kind of range is perfect, which is probably most households will be in the 20-degree range. So they do well. You want to put it on a sunny windowsill until you start seeing the shoots come up. Once the shoots come up, then you just want to keep them somewhere nice and bright, but avoid midday sun. Turnips, although they like a bit of warmth to germinate, when it comes to growing, if they get too warm, they do suffer a little bit and they can go to seed and they start flowering. If they start flowering, they're going to put all their energy into the flower and into the seeds. They're not going to put any energy into the turnip root that you're going to eat. So try and keep it as cool as possible when you're growing them indoors. About 20 degrees is a good temperature for them. And so if you're in a warmer location, keep them in an air-conditioned room, or you want to keep them away from the direct midday sun. So put them in an east or west facing window so they get the morning or afternoon sun, but not any direct sun in the midday, because that would be too hot for them. Keep them well watered as well. Turnips like quite a damp soil, so make sure the soil is damp. Check it every 2 or 3 days. If you're in a warm, dry house, you might need to water it more than every 2 or 3 days. If you're in a colder house, once a week might be perfectly fine. And they should start to germinate within a week or so. They do germinate quite quickly, these plants, so if there's nothing coming up after 2 or 3 weeks, something's probably gone wrong, and then you need to start again. So I'll come back now at a later stage of the video when they're starting to germinate. I'll talk a bit more about harvesting them and what they should be looking like as they germinate, so you know which are weeds and what are not weeds. So it's now 2.5 weeks later, and the turnips have germinated really quite well and very quickly as well. You can see we got quite a nice covering here in this large pot. We have got a couple here which seems to be coming up really late. You can see there's one just down there, but most of them germinated roughly at the same time. And when it comes to turnips, you can tell quite easily the shape of the leaf, what plant it is as it comes up, so it's quite easy to tell what weeds and what aren't weeds. So they have a characteristic leaf shape which you can just about see here. So it's those two outer leaves, the ones that look more waxy than the other ones. The ones in the middle, they're the true leaves, so they don't come up until afterward. But these ones on the outside, they come up straight away, very early on. And when it's very young, it will look like this tiny one down here. And those leaves will just slowly get bigger as time goes on. So you can see that tiny dark one right in the corner there. That's what it looks like when they first come up. And so they're quite characteristic, and they don't look like many other plants. But they do, if you have any other brassicas in your soil, so if you've got anything like cabbages or curly kale that's gone to seed or got mixed in, then they'll look just the same. But most other seed weeds don't look like that. So if you look for this characteristic kind of lobed shape, waxy leaves, that's what you're looking for with these. So these are going to grow really fast now. I'm not going to feed them because this is quite a rich multi-purpose compost. If you do have a rich multi-purpose compost, there's not much point feeding the turnips. Just keep them in well watered. As I said before, you keep them really quite nice and moist. If they get dry or if they get too hot, they will go to seed and you won't get a harvest. So keep them nice and damp. They should do quite well with that. With this pot where I'm just going to be growing the one plant, I'm going to look for the strongest one. So this one seems to be a stronger plant. You can see it's got slightly more leaves than this one here. This has got 2 true leaves. The true leaves are the second lot of leaves that come up. So the first lot of leaves are called the seed leaves or the cotyledons, and then you've got the true leaves which come on after that. There's 2 of them here. This one only seems to have 1 in a bit. So I'm just going to nip this out. If you pull it out, the problem is you might disturb the roots of the other plants. So if you can, nip it with your fingernails or with some scissors. And that way you don't disturb this one at all. That should grow on just fine. So that's how you can grow them as individual plants. But these ones here, what I'll do now is I'll put them on a time lapse so you can see them grow and fatten up. They will get quite congested, but as they get congested I'll start thinning them out. That way we can get a nice early harvest of really small turnips, and then at the end we'll just have 3 or 4 really larger ones about the size of a golf ball or maybe a tennis ball, and that'll be the last crop. So I'll put this on a time lapse now, and I'll see you in another video when I'm finally harvesting these turnips. So as you can see from that time lapse, the ones in the time lapse video did actually get a little bit leggy because there wasn't enough light from my grow lamps. I didn't have a sunny enough position for them. So you can see the difference here with the light levels. Basically this is the individual plant in good light levels. This is the one underneath the grow lights with the time lapse. It's got a little bit leggy. So you should expect your plants to look a bit more like this and less elongated, such as these ones here. But we're now at a stage 7 weeks later where we can start harvesting our first crops. So the one that was individually grown is looking really good. You can see there it's a good sized turnip. It's actually ready for harvesting now, but I could actually leave this a bit longer and let it grow larger, but I'm going to harvest this now. It's quite a small pot, so to support a bigger turnip would be a little bit difficult. If I wanted a bigger turnip, I would probably put it in a slightly bigger pot and let it grow on for another few weeks. But for now it's a good size, ready to harvest. The leaves are starting to go yellow as well, so in nutrient deficiency. I've been giving it a high potassium feed, basically a tomato feed, to encourage formation of the turnip there. If I gave it a high nitrogen feed, I'd probably get bigger leaves, and the leaves wouldn't go yellow like they are now, but I'd just get a lot of leaves and less turnip. So that's why the leaves are going yellow on that one. This one though is still growing quite well, but you can see it's getting really congested, especially as they were leggy. So I'm just going to show you now how you can selectively harvest them to make sure there's room for more to come, but so you can also get an early harvest and try and get a bit more space in here. So you want to be quite careful when you're harvesting them. You're just going to look out for the biggest plants or the most congested plants. And with a turnip you will need to wait until they've fattened up enough to actually get a small bowl for harvesting. And because this is really congested, if you find that you get really thick growth like this, sometimes you actually need to harvest them even before they're ready, just so that you can get a bit more space for the other ones to grow. So just be aware of that. If there's loads of plant in a small space, sometimes it's too much and all they'll do is grow leaves. You won't get much of a bulb, so you might need to thin them anyway without harvesting them. But in this one I'm just going to harvest a couple of the bigger ones which are ready for harvesting. Now these are going to be very small turnips, basically almost like micro turnips, so I'm not expecting much of a yield, but it's more just to give the other ones more space for growing, and I can just get a little crop as a bonus as well. So I'm just going to find the smallest one here, just get all the leaves together, and just going to carefully lift it up with a slight twisting action, and that should pull it out quite easily. Now I just have to be very careful not to damage too many of the other leaves, because there's a lot of other plants in here and I need those plants to continue growing so they'll fatten up further. So you can see there it's quite a small bulb in this one, but at least I've got a small crop and I've given a lot more space for the other ones to start growing. So I'll take out a couple more now of these ones that are just about big enough to be harvested, and I'll free up plenty of space for the other ones in this pot. So as you can see, this pot is now a lot less congested. I've also got 3 small turnips which I can then use and cook. They're very, very small, so I'm not expecting much of a harvest at all from these, especially once I remove the leaves and the roots. There's not going to be a huge amount left, but I can basically just trim off the top and then cut back the leaves as much as possible once I'm in the kitchen and get a small bit of root there for harvesting. But it's actually this turnip I'm more interested in. I'm going to get a much better crop with this one. So I'm just going to carefully remove it from the pot here and see how much of a turnip we've got. So you can see there, when it comes to turnips, they do mostly grow on the surface. Although they're classed as a root vegetable, it's more the stem that gets swollen. But it depends how deeply they've been planted. Some of them tend to grow a bit more underground, other ones less, but they tend to be half in, half out generally. And that's basically the harvested turnip. I can probably use some of the leaves in some recipes, but it's mainly the turnip I'm going to be going for. And that's basically how you harvest them. So that's just about it for this video. If you want the best turnips, grow them individually. You'll get much better turnips that way, and the bigger the pot the better. But if you're short of space, even a small 9cm pot like the one I use will produce a decent sized turnip. Also, if you want a longer season and you've just got a small space, go for a slightly larger pot and just start harvesting them earlier. You'll get several ones about this size as the season goes on. So this pot probably has about 15 plants in it. I should be able to get about 15 plants at this size or bigger. Basically the first few harvests are going to be the smallest. As time goes on, as the other ones have more space to grow, they're going to be bigger, and the last 2 or 3 that I harvest from that pot should be quite similar in size to this one here, because they'll have a lot more space, a lot more soil for them to get the roots established in. And so at the end of the season you'll be left with 2 or 3 this size, but in the build up to those bigger ones you'll also have several smaller ones like this which you can also harvest.